Good evening and welcome to Newsmax Prime. I'm J.D. Hayworth. Of prime interest tonight, getting some help from the home front, heading down the home stretch. The way I see it, a campaign often depends on the candidate's spouse. 2 decades ago, in my second campaign for Congress, what was really my first run for re-election, the climb was mighty steep. I was the #1 target of organized labor. The labor bosses running over 300 TV spots a day in Phoenix, falsely claiming that I wanted to kill Medicare. I had Al Gore's former chief of staff running against me, so the vice president not only kicked off his campaign, he was actively raising funds for him. And even though Bob Dole was a great man, he was running 20 points behind Bill Clinton in my district. So what, or more appropriately, who made the difference? Simple. My wife. In the final weeks of that 1996 campaign, Miss Mary made speeches, wrote letters, and basically spoke from her heart. Despite the vicious attack ads and the big money brought into Arizona to defeat me, my sweet and petite spouse had a huge impact. Here's how bad things had gotten. Mary was speaking to a Republican women's club in the final week before Election Day. You figure those GOP ladies would be in my corner, right? Wrong. Until Mary made her speech and spoke sincerely about the man she married rather than the caricature portrayed in all those negative TV ads, about half those women were going to vote for my Democrat opponent. Mary didn't use poll-tested phrases. She didn't address the issues from A to Z. Instead, she became a character witness on my behalf. To say she was effective would be an understatement. The women in that audience told her afterwards that after listening to her, they were voting for me. Other ladies wrote in letters responding to what she had written them, saying the same thing. Simply stated, I owed my eventual victory to my wife. Don't be surprised if it happens again, maybe 3 weeks from today. And that's the way I see it. With the final presidential debate tomorrow night, Mr. Trump still needs help with women, so that may mean more of Melania. Miranda Kahn has more on that.
JD, there's no doubt about it. Trump's taken quite a few hits these past few weeks, and who better to defend the Donald and stop the bleeding than Mrs. Trump herself?
You work hard for what you want in life.
We haven't seen or heard much from Melania Trump since her infamous speech at the GOP convention.
Well, it was my decision not to be on the campaign trail. My priority is our son, and I want to be a mother first.
But that all changed last night when Mrs. Trump decided to make the media rounds to defend the Donald.
My husband is kind, he's a gentleman, he cares about people, he cares about women.
Most polls showed Trump's numbers have been steadily on the decline since recent sexual allegations surfaced against him.
His hands were everywhere, up my skirt.
Trump has denied all of them and questioned the political timing of the accusations, and Melania does too.
Why now? Why 3 weeks before the election? That is not the person that I know. Did they ever check the background of these women? I believe my husband.
As for that leaked access Hollywood tape,
those words, they were offensive to me and they were inappropriate. And I accept his apology. We are moving on.
And speaking of moving on, if the Trumps do move on and into the White House, Melania says the topic or issue she would like to deal with on a personal level is social media, specifically cyberbullying. JD?
Now, Miranda, we heard earlier, and we'll replay a clip from Donald Trump from the Joe Pag show, but the candidate himself was very impressed with his wife's handling of those interviews last night. Do you believe she can be the difference maker down the home stretch?
Whether or not she'll be the difference maker, I think that's hard to tell, but I can say it certainly can't hurt, as you said yourself with your wife in your situation. So he needs something to stop the bleeding.
Just like to stress, it was a little different situation 20 years ago, but Mary's help really made the difference for me.
It'll be interesting to see if that works out for Trump.
We'll find out. Thanks very much, Miranda. For more, let's talk about all this now with our panel. First, Skyping in from New York City, columnist and political commentator Liz Peek, and joining us from Newsmax New York, political advisor Sam Nunberg. Thanks to you both for your time tonight on Newsmax Prime. Something else happened in Colorado Springs today, a policy initiative from Donald Trump that hit a responsive chord, saying there need to be term limits for Congress. Liz, in your opinion, how will that be received by the voters?
People would go wild if they thought we might actually impose term limits. Obviously, it depends on how it's done, how many terms you're talking about, et cetera. But I got to tell you, I've written about this a number of times in the past, and it always elicits a very vocal and supportive response. Because if you talk to the watchdogs, the ethical watchdogs that watch over Congress, and there's one that's left, they will both tell you that the number one sign for corruption in office is time in office. You let somebody think that they've got a sinecure, a job in Congress for the rest of their life, and guess what? They don't perform very well, and in fact, oftentimes they perform very badly, like Charlie Rangel, who has been on the most corrupt list for, I think, a decade.
And Sam, you take a look at the numbers for Congress, that's one thing that unites the American people. In terms of this term limit proposal, does this help change the conversation, get it back on issues and that outsider approach for Donald Trump?
Well, I think you just hit all marks, JD, in exactly what you said. And, you know, this polls very well. This is something that was discussed early on in his campaign. It certainly helps him. It gives that idea and that narrative that he's going to come in, he's going to work for the people, he's going to be against Washington and make sure that he ends the corruption. And I think if we add this along with the policy that he proposed last night in Wisconsin for lobbyist reform and for making sure that we can't have high-level administration workers lobby for foreign governments, which is directly in contrast, by the way, to the Clintons. And as we've seen with the Clinton Foundation, that he can hit this home. But, you know, JD, the big issue is he has to talk about this in the debate tomorrow night. If he just communicates it where we're just going to hear about it at rallies, then it's not going to be able to get that mass communication. And he also, by the way, should have penned some opinion pieces, I think, to put in to some major influential newspapers as well.
Well, lots of luck getting them in there. The way the newspapers are, they're pretty much anti-Trump. Well. Which, Liz, brings me back to the topic that the alphabet media, by and large, has avoided, WikiLeaks and that email dump. There was one email that caught everybody's attention yesterday with 3 words from the Latin, quid pro quo. Apparently, the State Department wanted the FBI to reclassify one of Mrs. Clinton's emails as not classified. In exchange, some FBI agents would be placed in countries heretofore forbidden. Mr. Trump was quick to seize on that at his rally last night in Wisconsin.
We're witnessing a criminal enterprise that has turned our government into a vehicle for the Clintons' personal profit at your expense. But it gets worse. It gets worse. The FBI documents that show Undersecretary of State Patrick Kennedy made the request for altering classification as part of a quid pro quo. In other words, a deal. This is felony corruption by any standard. Undersecretary Kennedy needs to resign.
So there's Trump laying it out, Liz, and again, this outsider reformer image. And the allegations. I mean, you have to lay them out there. Is that going to be effective for Mr. Trump?
Well, I think you're totally, yes, it could be if he stays with these themes and these messages, if he can hammer these ideas home in the debate instead of getting sidetracked in a sort of verbal assault on Hillary Clinton. If he talks about issues, he's on the winning side of all these things. Voters are so sick and tired of corruption and lobbyists and all the rest. Yes, he can score big points with this, but again, he has to deliver that message, not just in a teleprompter speech, but over and over again, and most importantly, tomorrow night.
What about that, Sam? I mean, the situation is Hillary is vulnerable on her honesty or the lack thereof. Now, does he keep it issue-oriented, or does he just say, Mrs. Clinton, the sad fact is, people don't trust you?
Well, just to go back on what Liz just said, JD, I think it's very important for him to continue this narrative and to have a vision for the country, because what he sometimes falls into, which will not work on a national level, JD, is becoming too much of a grievance protest candidate. Now, on to Kennedy. I think your audience should know a little about Kennedy. You know, I find it very ironic that Kennedy was willing to have FBI agents go into these countries at embassies where they're not normally allowed to, because Hillary Clinton had actually delegated to Kennedy to secure the embassies. And, you know, Ambassador Stevens, when he was in Benghazi and when he was in Libya, had written directly to Kennedy that he needed more security. And so apparently Kennedy can only ignore that when, you know, it wouldn't be good politically to send more security there to protect Stevens. But when he needs to protect Hillary because she was sending classified material on an illegal server, then, you know, he's all about it. And as you know, as our mutual friend Mark Levin talks about, it's just the federal leviathan. These are creatures of government. This guy is not government appointed. He works for the government. You can't even fire him, frankly. And, you know, it just shows the dirtiness of D.C. and why Donald Trump can really, if he's able to attack on this too as well tomorrow night and give his alternative vision, then I think that this is a net positive.
Yeah, the challenge for this, Sam, with all due respect, is to lay out the Patrick Kennedy indictment, if you will, is pretty tough. It may work better in an ad, but Liz, he's got to make this short, sweet, pointed, and effective. And give you the final 20 seconds before we have to step aside here.
I think that's exactly right, JD. I mean, even here, we've had trouble articulating it. If you read the New York Times piece about this story today, you're going to absolutely fall over laughing because they made it out to be a controversy over whether or not something actually was classified. It had nothing to do with trying to keep Hillary Clinton from being indicted or showing that she was lying about having classified information. I mean, really, I honestly think there are about 10 data points that Trump has to narrow into 20 seconds to prove the case that
and
the Clinton...
Speaking of 20 seconds, time has us right here, but you're going to come back, both of you. We look forward to that. Also, Mr. Trump calling for a drug test before tomorrow night's debate. Wait till you hear the reaction from the White House. That and more when we come back.